Picture this. The year is 1855. A group of wealthy Victorian ladies in their finest silk dresses are crawling through the mud, on their hands and knees, in the rain, fighting over a plant. Not a magic plant, not a medicinal plant, a fern, a regular fern. One of them just paid 3 months' wages for a single leaf. Another hired armed guards to protect her fern collection. Down the road, men are literally stealing ferns in the dead of night like they're robbing banks. All of Britain has gone completely insane over ferns. They called it Pteridomania. We call it Victorian Fern Fever. And it nearly drove multiple species extinct because Victorian England couldn't chill about houseplants. You're listening to Wait, That Actually Happened, where we prove history is stranger than fiction. I'm your host, author Daniel P. Douglas, and today we're talking about the time an entire nation lost its mind over plants you've probably walked past 1,000 times without noticing. Seriously, they almost caused ecological collapse over ferns. Okay, so Victorian Britain in the 1850s was weird, and I mean really weird. This was the height of the British Empire. They controlled like a quarter of the planet. They had more money than they knew what to do with. The Industrial Revolution meant rich people had tons of free time, and they were bored. Really, really bored. See, if you were a wealthy Victorian, especially a wealthy Victorian woman, you couldn't really do much. You couldn't work. You couldn't vote. You couldn't even show your ankles without causing a scandal. Your job was to sit around, look pretty, and maybe do some embroidery. Then someone discovered you could grow ferns indoors. This was huge. Before this, houseplants weren't really a thing. Most plants died inside because of coal smoke from heating. But ferns? Ferns were tough. They could survive in dark, smoky Victorian houses. So, in 1829, this doctor named Nathaniel Ward invented something called a Wardian case. It's basically a sealed glass box for plants, like a tiny greenhouse. Suddenly, you could keep tropical plants alive in cold, gross London. By 1840, everyone who was anyone had Wardian cases full of ferns. But that wasn't enough, because Victorians never did anything halfway. The science world was also going fern crazy. Charles Darwin was writing about evolution. Scientists were finding fossils. And ferns? Ferns were ancient. They were around before the dinosaurs. They reproduced without flowers or seeds, which totally blew Victorian minds. Books started coming out. A Popular History of British Ferns in 1851, then more books, then more. By 1855, there were dozens of fern books, fern magazines, fern poetry. Yes, poetry about ferns. The perfect storm was brewing. Rich people with nothing to do, a new technology that let you grow exotic plants indoors. And scientists saying ferns were the coolest thing ever. What could go wrong? So here's where it gets completely bonkers. By 1850, collecting ferns wasn't just a hobby, it was the hobby. They even gave it a fancy Greek name, Pteridomania. Pterido means fern, mania means, well, mania. Basically, they were cray-cray over ferns. At first, people just collected common ferns from their gardens. But common ferns were for common people. If you wanted to be somebody, you needed rare ferns. The rarest British fern was the Killarney fern. It only grew in a few spots in Ireland and Western Britain. One collector described finding one as better than finding gold. Professional fern hunters became a real job. They'd disappear into the mountains for weeks, coming back with bags full of rare specimens. They'd sell them to wealthy collectors for insane prices. We're talking £5 for a single fern. That's when workers earned £50 a year. Women started abandoning traditional Victorian activities to hunt ferns. And remember, these are women who wore corsets so tight they could barely breathe. They wore dresses with 20 pounds of fabric. And they're climbing mountains and crawling through caves. The fashion industry went nuts. Special fern hunting outfits were invented. Fern collecting pouches, fern pressing books, fern carrying cases. There were fern hats with real ferns attached. I'm not kidding. One lady, Sarah Whittingham, became famous for her collection. She had over 50,000 dried fern specimens. 50,000. She built special rooms just to store them all. But here's where it gets dark. Collectors would hire teams to strip entire areas clean. One account from 1865 describes 40 collectors descending on a single valley in Wales. They took everything, every single fern. The valley looked like it had been hit by a plague. The Killarney fern basically went extinct in most of Britain. Other species disappeared from entire regions. Collectors would find a rare fern location and tell nobody. They'd harvest it all themselves, then sell the ferns for massive profits. People started stealing ferns from each other. There are actual police reports of fern theft. Imagine calling the cops because someone stole your plant. Officer, they took my asplenium. It was right there in my fernery. Oh, yeah, ferneries. Rich people built entire glass buildings just for ferns, not greenhouses with other plants, just ferns. Some were bigger than houses. The fernery at Benmore Gardens in Scotland had over 200 species. The British weren't satisfied with just British ferns. They wanted tropical ferns, Arctic ferns, ferns from places they couldn't even pronounce. Ships would arrive from colonies carrying nothing but ferns. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew was basically Fern Central. By the 1870s, you couldn't escape ferns. They were printed on everything: wallpaper, carpets, dishes, furniture, Christmas cards, birthday cards, sympathy cards. There were fern patterns on toilets, on tombstones. Churches had fern decorations. They put ferns on cookies. Publishers released fern identification books that sold better than novels. There were fern hunting clubs, fern exhibitions, fern competitions. The Manchester Fern Society had over 400 members who met weekly to talk about ferns. Even Queen Victoria got into it. She had a royal fern collection. When the queen does something, everyone has to do it too. Not collecting ferns was basically treason. By the 1890s, the fern situation was catastrophic. Entire regions had no ferns left. The Killarney fern survived in maybe 3 locations in all of Britain. Other species were gone completely. We don't even know how many went extinct because the Victorians collected them all before scientists could properly catalog them. Parliament actually had to pass laws. The first environmental protection laws in British history were basically stop stealing all the ferns, you maniacs. But laws didn't stop the fever. You know what did? They ran out of ferns to collect. No, really. By the 1890s, collectors had taken so many ferns that there weren't enough interesting ones left. The rare ones were gone. The semi-rare ones were in private collections. All that remained were common ferns, and nobody wanted those. The fever broke almost overnight. By 1900, those expensive ferneries were being torn down or converted to regular greenhouses. Fern collections were dumped in gardens or just thrown away. Books about ferns became worthless. Some collectors felt so guilty they tried to return ferns to the wild, but captive ferns often died when replanted. Plus, nobody remembered exactly where they came from originally. The ecological damage took decades to recover. Some areas didn't see ferns return for 50 years. The Killarney fern is still endangered today in 2025 because of something that happened in 1860. The weirdest part? Most Victorians didn't particularly like ferns. They collected them because everyone else was collecting them. It was the world's first FOMO ecological disaster. You think we've learned? Ha! Remember the succulent craze of 2010? Air plants in 2015? Monstera deliciosa taking over Instagram in 2020? Same energy, different century. People are paying $10,000 for a variegated Monstera cutting. One cutting. That's not even a whole plant. That's just a leaf with some roots, and people are taking out loans for it. We've got plant influencers now. Plant Instagram is basically Victorian fern societies, but with better photos and worse Latin pronunciation. People are definitely still crawling through forests looking for rare plants to sell on Etsy. The difference is we have environmental laws now. Usually, unless you're in Florida where people are stripping orchids from the Everglades, or California where people are stealing succulents from public parks, or literally anywhere with valuable plants. At least Victorians were honest about their plant theft. They didn't pretend it was foraging or wild crafting. They straight up admitted they were ransacking nature for living room decorations. Imagine Fern Fever in 2025. First, someone on TikTok posts about this amazing air purifying ancient plant. Goes viral. Hashtag Fern Talk explodes. Suddenly, everyone needs ferns. Influencers start posting fern hauls. I spent $5,000 on rare ferns. YouTube videos getting millions of views. Fern unboxing videos. Fern collection tours. Rating celebrity fern collections. NFT bros would absolutely make crypto ferns. Own this unique digital fern, only 10,000 minted. Amazon would sell out of ferns in hours. People would camp outside Home Depot for fern deliveries. There'd be fern drops like sneaker drops. Bots would buy all the ferns to resell at 500% markup. Someone would definitely start Fern Prime. Get exclusive rare ferns delivered monthly, only $299 per month. And somewhere a botanist would be screaming into the void, "They're just ferns." So that's Victorian fern fever, when an entire empire nearly caused ecological collapse because they thought houseplants were cool. They drove species extinct, crawled through mud in ball gowns, and built entire buildings just to show off their plant collections. Next week, we're heading to 1904 for the Olympic marathon that went so wrong, it's amazing anyone survived. We're talking runners drinking rat poison, eating rotten apples, and nearly dying of dust inhalation. The winner hallucinated the entire last mile. Be sure to check out my Substack intelligence bulletin from author Daniel P. Douglas for more podcast episodes, written articles, and links to my books. Until next time, remember, truth is stranger than fiction, and history is weirder than you think. Thanks everyone for listening. Have a memorable day.